You are standing on the walls of Rome. The year is 410. Smoke coils into the sky. The sound below you is not celebration. It is breaking wood, shattered marble, screams carried by the wind. For 8 centuries, this city has been untouchable, eternal, the center of the world. And now you watch as men in foreign armor pour through its gates. They are led by Alaric, a name whispered for years. A threat negotiated, bribed, postponed, never truly confronted. You grip the stone battlement. You were told Rome could not fall, that its gods favored it, that its laws bound the world together, that its legions were invincible. So how did it come to this? Below, temples are forced open, villas ransacked, statues dragged from their pedestals, gold stripped from sacred spaces. But the strangest thing is not the violence. It is the disbelief. Citizens wander the streets in shock. Senators hide in ancestral homes built by men who conquered continents. Priests clutch relics. Merchants guard empty vaults. Everyone is asking the same silent question. When did the ground begin to give way? The empire did not collapse in a single night. It did not crumble with one invasion. It did not die with one emperor. For generations, cracks had spread through its foundations. Cracks disguised as reforms, as victories, as compromises. You have lived through them. Higher taxes, fewer recruits, foreign soldiers wearing Roman insignia, emperors rising and falling in dizzying succession, promises of renewal, whispers of decline. But no one believed the center could fail. Because Rome was not just a city. It was an idea, a belief that order could dominate chaos, that civilization could tame the world, that power, once achieved, could be permanent. Tonight, that belief burns. Yet this sack is not the end. It is a symptom, a visible fracture in something far larger. The real collapse began long before the gates were breached. It began in triumph, in ambition, in overreach, and in choices made by men who believed they were saving Rome. So the question is not why Rome was attacked. The question is this: how does a superpower decay from within, while still convincing itself it is eternal? And if Rome could fall, what does that say about every empire that came after it? Rome was not built in a moment of glory. It was built in repetition, in discipline, in systems that turned conquest into structure. At its height, under Trajan, the empire stretched from the cold rains of Britannia to the burning sands of Arabia, from the Atlantic Ocean to the edges of Mesopotamia. Nearly 60 million people lived under its authority. Different languages, different gods, different customs, yet bound by roads, by law, by taxation, by fear, and by opportunity. A merchant in Alexandria could ship grain to Rome and know the sea lanes were patrolled. A farmer in Gaul could appeal to Roman courts instead of tribal vengeance. A soldier recruited in the Balkans could earn citizenship through blood. This was Rome's genius. It did not simply conquer. It absorbed, it standardized, it promised stability. And for centuries, it delivered. Stone roads stitched the provinces together. Aqueducts carried water across valleys. Amphitheaters rose in distant cities that had once resisted Roman rule. Latin spread, not as poetry alone, but as administration, contracts, orders, law codes etched in bronze. The empire functioned because millions believed participation was better than resistance. Taxes were heavy, service was long. But in return, Rome offered something rare in the ancient world: predictability. And predictability is power. Yet beneath the surface of order, motion never stopped. Frontiers required guarding. Barbarian tribes pressed along the Rhine and Danube. The Parthians tested the eastern boundaries. Each victory demanded garrisons. Each garrison demanded supply lines. Each supply line demanded money. The machine grew larger and heavier and more dependent on constant expansion. Because conquest funded the system. Spoils paid soldiers. New lands meant new taxpayers. Glory meant legitimacy for emperors. When expansion slowed, the math began to change. The empire was now feeding itself, and feeding an army that consumed enormous resources. In Rome itself, life pulsed with contradiction. The capital was magnificent. Marble temples, public baths steaming with conversation, markets overflowing with spices, silk, and slaves, but also tenements packed with the poor, crowded insulae leaning over narrow streets, grain dole distributions to prevent unrest, bread and circuses to distract, spectacles in the Colosseum, victories paraded through triumphal arches. The people were entertained. But entertainment can conceal anxiety. Citizenship had once been a privilege. Gradually, it became universal. In 212, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire. It was framed as unity, but it also expanded the tax base. The center needed revenue. More soldiers were recruited from frontier regions, men with little connection to Rome itself, loyal to commanders more than to distant senators. Power shifted subtly, from civic institutions to military authority, from shared republican memory to imperial survival. Religion, too, evolved. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars still stood in their temples, but mystery cults spread. Isis from Egypt, Mithras among soldiers. Later, a small sect worshipping a crucified teacher would grow quietly in the shadows. Belief was no longer singular. It was layered, competing, searching. As borders stretched thin, emperors faced a paradox: rule everything, or hold what you have. Some chose consolidation. Others gambled on renewed expansion. Each decision rippled across provinces, and in distant villages, farmers felt the consequences of policies crafted in marble halls. A drought meant unpaid taxes. Unpaid taxes meant punishment. Local elites were pressured to collect more. Corruption crept in. Not dramatic at first. Just adjustments. Just shortcuts. Just survival. The empire still looked strong. Legions marched, coins bore the emperor's face. Edicts declared stability. But stability required constant motion, and motion requires energy. What happens when the energy begins to thin? In the 3rd century, storms gathered, not as a single invasion, but as overlapping crises. Plague reduced populations. Trade routes faltered. Inflation spiraled as emperors debased currency to pay troops. Silver content in coins dropped. Prices rose. Trust eroded. Soldiers proclaimed their generals emperor. Emperors lasted months, sometimes weeks. Civil war became cyclical. The empire did not shatter, it strained. Like a massive structure absorbing tremors. Reforms came, most dramatically under Diocletian. He divided rule among 4 emperors. The Tetrarchy, an attempt to manage vast territory more efficiently, to respond faster to threats, to stabilize succession. He fixed prices, reorganized provinces, expanded bureaucracy. It was brilliant, and desperate. Because the old model no longer worked. The empire was too large, too complex, too expensive. When one problem was solved, another surfaced. When borders were secured, internal rivalries erupted. When taxes were raised, resentment grew. And yet, for ordinary people, life continued. Fields were planted. Children were born. Contracts were signed. Weddings celebrated. Most citizens did not feel they were living through decline. They felt they were adapting. Empires rarely collapse in a single visible moment. They transform, gradually, often invisibly, until the cumulative weight of adaptation becomes something else. Something fragile, something brittle. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between reforms and revolts, a new faith was spreading, a faith that would change Rome's identity forever. How would that belief reshape power itself? And would unity through faith heal the fractures, or deepen them? The empire did not fall because it lacked strength. It fell because its strength became unstable. Because power, once centralized, began to fracture. After the reforms of Diocletian, the illusion of permanence briefly returned. For emperors, for capitals, shared authority, clear succession. It looked rational, efficient. But Rome had never truly shared power well. Ambition does not divide itself neatly. When Diocletian stepped down, the system trembled. Rivalries resurfaced. Armies chose sides. Civil war returned, and from that chaos emerged a single victor. Constantine the Great, a soldier emperor, with vision and calculation. Before battle at the Milvian Bridge, he claimed to see a sign in the sky, a cross of light, a promise of victory. Whether faith or strategy, he embraced Christianity, and everything shifted. For 3 centuries, Christians had been a minority, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted. Now, imperial favor transformed them. With the Edict of Milan, Christianity became legal. Soon, it would become dominant. Temples of Jupiter still stood, but basilicas began to rise. Bishops gained influence. The empire's spiritual center was changing. And Constantine did something even more radical. He moved the capital, east, to a city reborn as Constantinople. Strategic, wealthy, closer to the empire's most prosperous provinces. The Mediterranean shifted its gravity. Rome remained symbolic. But power was relocating. The western provinces began to feel distant, underfunded, exposed in the east. Trade flowed. Cities thrived. Administration strengthened. In the west, pressures intensified. Germanic tribes were no longer distant raiders. They were migrants, refugees, entire peoples moving under pressure from new forces beyond the frontier. The Huns pushed westward, and waves followed. Goths approached Roman borders seeking entry, seeking safety, seeking land. Rome allowed some to settle, under supervision, under treaty, but corruption poisoned the arrangement. Roman officials exploited them, starved them, humiliated them. Desperation turned to rebellion. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, Emperor Valens marched against the Goths. He underestimated them. His army was crushed. He was killed. A Roman emperor, dead on the battlefield. The psychological blow was immense. Rome had always recovered from defeat. But this felt different. The enemy was not across the sea. They were inside imperial territory, entire tribes, armed and organized. The empire began negotiating survival instead of dictating terms. Gothic warriors were enlisted into Roman armies, settled as allies, not subjects. But loyalty built on necessity is fragile. Meanwhile, succession remained unstable. Generals competed. Court intrigues multiplied. Young emperors were manipulated by powerful military commanders. In the West, figures like Stilicho attempted to hold the line, balancing diplomacy and force. But political paranoia led to his execution. And with him, one of the West's most capable defenders was gone. Then came the moment you stood upon in the beginning. In 410, Alaric I entered Rome, not to annihilate it, but to force recognition, to secure land and status for his people. The sack lasted 3 days. Symbolic more than apocalyptic. Yet symbols matter. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the city had fallen to a foreign army. The myth of invincibility shattered. But still, the empire endured. The eastern half stabilized. The western half weakened, economically drained, militarily overstretched, politically fragmented. In 451, a new threat emerged. Attila and his Huns swept into Gaul. Cities burned, fields ravaged. A fragile coalition of Romans and Goths stopped him at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. A rare moment of unity, but unity born of fear. When Attila later approached Italy, famine and disease slowed him. Diplomacy intervened. Rome survived again, but survival was becoming reactive, no longer proactive. By the mid-5th century, emperors in the West were figureheads. Real authority lay with military strongmen, many of them of barbarian origin, men who had risen through Roman ranks, who commanded Roman troops, who defended Roman borders, and who increasingly decided who wore the imperial purple. Then, in 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus August. The title of Western Roman Emperor was abolished. The imperial regalia sent east to Constantinople. No dramatic last battle, no grand apocalypse, just a transfer of authority, an administrative conclusion to a long erosion. Yet here is the paradox. The people living through 476 did not feel the world end. Taxes were still collected. Cities still functioned. Churches still gathered worshippers. Life continued. But something profound had shifted. The western half of the Roman Empire had ceased to exist as an imperial state. Power had decentralized. Authority localized. The superpower had become a memory. And yet, the Eastern Empire continued for nearly 1,000 more years. Was this truly a fall? Or a transformation? Was Rome destroyed by invasion? Or by adaptation stretched too far? By ambition too vast? By systems too heavy for their own success? And if decline is gradual, how do those inside it ever recognize the turning point? The empire did not vanish overnight. It thinned. It unraveled. It changed shape in the hands of those who remained. In the western provinces, after 476, there was no announcement of the end. No trumpet declaring collapse. There was simply fewer officials. Fewer soldiers arriving from distant regions. Fewer ships docking with Egyptian grain. In Italy, Spain, Gaul, and North Africa, Roman administration slowly gave way to new rulers. Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, names once spoken with suspicion, now attached to kings who adopted Roman titles, who minted coins with familiar symbols, who governed from Roman cities. The structures did not disappear. They were inherited. A landowner in southern Gaul still rose at dawn, still oversaw tenants, still worried about harvest yields. But instead of appealing to an imperial governor appointed from Rome, he negotiated with a Gothic king. The language of power shifted. The rituals of loyalty shifted. Yet daily survival remained constant. For peasants, the change was subtle. Taxes were still owed. Fields still plowed. But protection became local. security tied to nearby strongmen rather than distant emperors. Trade routes contracted, long-distance commerce declined. Without the vast logistical network of the empire, goods moved more slowly. Sometimes not at all. Cities shrank. Public baths fell into disrepair. Aqueducts cracked, not always from destruction, often from neglect. Maintenance requires coordination. Coordination requires resources. And resources require trust in a larger system. That system was fragmenting. In North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, the Vandals controlled vital grain supplies. In Britain, Roman legions had withdrawn decades earlier. Communities defended themselves against raids. The imperial center no longer responded. In Spain and Gaul, Roman elites adapted. They married into Gothic families. They served as administrators for new courts. Identity became layered. Roman by culture. Gothic by allegiance. Christian by faith. The church emerged as a stabilizing force. While imperial authority faded, bishops gained influence. They mediated disputes, organized charity, preserved literacy. In cities like Rome, the bishop later called the Pope became a central figure. When secular power faltered, spiritual authority filled the void. The empire's old gods had once unified its imagination. Now Christianity bound fragmented kingdoms through shared belief. A different kind of empire was forming. Not territorial, but spiritual. In the East, however, the story was different. Centered in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, remained formidable. Its walls stood impregnable. Its treasury healthier. Its administration more cohesive. Greek gradually replaced Latin as the dominant language of governance. Roman law was codified under emperors like Justinian. Ambitious campaigns briefly reconquered, lost western territories, Italy, North Africa, parts of Spain. For a moment, it seemed Rome could be restored. But reconquest was costly. Plagues swept through cities. Wars with Persia drained resources. Later, the rise of Islam would challenge Eastern dominance. Even survival required adaptation. Yet Constantinople endured for centuries. A reminder that collapse is rarely uniform. In the West, literacy narrowed to monasteries and clerical circles. In the East, classical knowledge was preserved and studied. Two trajectories emerging from one imperial origin. For ordinary people, the end of centralized empire meant uncertainty. Travel became riskier. Roads less secure. Markets more regional. Opportunities more limited. But it also meant localization. Communities relied on themselves, on kinship, on feudal bonds that would define medieval Europe. The idea of citizenship faded. In its place came allegiance to lords, to kings, to faith. The Roman tax collector was replaced by the local noble, the imperial army by personal retinues. Power became personal, negotiated face to face. The psychological shift was profound. For centuries, Rome had represented universal order, a single authority stretching across continents. Now Europe fractured into kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy, each invoking Rome's memory. The title emperor did not disappear. It was resurrected, reimagined, contested, because even in absence, Rome remained the benchmark. And what of the people who remembered? The elderly senator who had once debated policy in a marble forum. The soldier who had marched under imperial standards. The merchant who had traded from Carthage to Antioch. They lived long enough to feel the narrowing of their world, to sense that something vast had receded, not in flames, but in reach. The empire's collapse was not simply political, it was psychological, a contraction of horizons. Yet from that contraction, new forms emerged. Medieval kingdoms, feudal systems, Christian Europe, the seeds of future nations. Transformation often feels like loss in the moment. Only later does it reveal new patterns. The fall of Rome did not return Europe to darkness. It reconfigured its light. But here is the deeper question. Was Rome a victim of invasion, or of its own complexity? Did it fall because enemies were strong, or because sustaining such scale demanded more than any system could provide indefinitely? Every empire centralizes, expands, then struggles to maintain coherence across diversity. Rome mastered integration. But integration created dependence. On constant revenue, on military loyalty, on administrative competence. When those threads frayed, the fabric loosened, not ripped apart at once, but gradually, until by the time of Odoacer's quiet coup, the imperial structure in the West was already hollow. And yet, its language, its law, its faith, its architecture, its imagination of order, all survived. So perhaps the more haunting truth is this. Rome did not truly die. It dissolved into the civilizations that followed. But what does that mean for the idea of superpowers? For nations that believe themselves indispensable? For systems so vast they seem permanent? If Rome's collapse was slow, adaptive, almost invisible, could the same be true of any dominant power? And would those living inside it recognize the signs? Before the walls begin to smoke. When you stood on the walls in 410, watching smoke rise above Rome, it felt like an ending. But history rarely ends. It transforms. The sack by Alaric did not destroy the Roman world. It revealed its exhaustion. The deposition of Romulus August by Odoacer did not shatter civilization. It confirmed a shift already underway. The real collapse had begun centuries earlier, in overextension, in reliance on endless expansion, in political instability, masked by ceremony, in economic strain disguised as reform. Rome's fall was slow because Rome was vast. Its systems were so powerful that they absorbed shock after shock. Civil wars, plagues, migrations, religious transformation. Each crisis survived, each reform celebrated, until survival itself became fragmentation. That is the paradox of superpowers. They rarely fall at the moment of visible weakness. They weaken while appearing strong. Rome believed its roads, its legions, its law made it eternal. But complexity has a cost. Scale demands energy. Unity requires trust. When trust erodes, systems grow brittle. The people inside them adapt, normalize instability, adjust to reduced horizons. By the time the center no longer holds, life has already reorganized around its absence. And yet, Rome never truly vanished. Its law shapes modern legal systems. Its language echoes in entire continents. Its concept of citizenship defines political identity. Its church became a transnational force. Its eastern half endured for another 1,000 years in Constantinople. Rome dissolved, but its DNA spread. So the curiosity we began with remains. How does a superpower decay while believing itself eternal? Slowly, through adaptation that masks erosion, through victories that hide structural fatigue, through leaders who promise restoration while postponing reckoning. The Roman Empire did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because maintaining its strength required more cohesion, more resources, more shared belief than any human system can guarantee forever. Empires are human creations, and humans are finite. The walls always look solid until one day they don't. The question is not whether power fades. It always does. The question is whether we recognize the cracks while we are still standing on the walls.